So my recent reading has involved a lot of review or understanding, or trying to understand some of the current debates about who actually wrote the Gospels and the dating of the Gospels and all of that sort of thing. And I thought, I was kind of casting about for something to talk about this evening, and a friend suggested, well, if that's what you're reading about, why don't you take like 4 meetings and do 10 minutes on each of the Gospels? And I thought that was a good idea. So I'm going to start, for reasons that I think will become apparent, with Matthew's Gospel. So Matthew, also known as Levi, of course, was the tax collector. He was sitting at the toll booth in Capernaum when he responded to Jesus' call. Very briefly, the kind of current scholarly view has a couple of components to it. The first is that all of the material we find in Mark's Gospel, we also find in Matthew's. And so the majority view is that Mark was an important source for Matthew, that Matthew's dependent upon Mark, and so is therefore was written after Mark was written. The second component is something called Q. A lot of the sayings that appear in Matthew and Luke are, in many cases, just verbatim, word for word, which has led to speculation that the two of them used a source that we no longer have that was a collection of Jesus' sayings. Q is short for Quelle, the German word for source. But sort of by this analysis, Matthew would have been written after Mark. Mark would have been written after 65 AD, so we're probably talking 70 at the earliest for Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's probably dead by that point in time, so of course we get all the critical scholarship that says this is, this is second or third generation. It's not terribly historical, that sort of thing. In sort of the critical and secular assessment of the Gospel. Contrasting with that is the traditional view, which is that it was written by Matthew the Apostle. Papias, who we've met before, Papias was a bishop of Hierapolis, and writing between 100 and 110, Papias said, Matthew put together the logia, the words or the sayings of the Lord in the Hebrew language. And Irenaeus, who we've also met before, Irenaeus was the bishop of Lyon. He was a student of Polycarp, who was a student of the Apostle John. So we know where he got his information. Irenaeus says, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, and laying the foundations of the church there. Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. This is why the Gospels appear in the New Testament in the order that they do, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And actually, I've quoted Irenaeus, but the early church fathers are unanimous that Matthew was actually the first gospel written, which was new information for me. And in fact, there's quite a bit of internal evidence. I won't go through everything, but for example, Jesus talks about paying the temple tax. We didn't pay the temple tax after the temple was destroyed, which we know was an event that took place in 70 AD. It talks about being reconciled to someone that you've offended before making your offering at the altar. Again, there's no offering to make at an altar once the temple is destroyed. So internal evidence supports the idea that it's earlier than 70 AD. So I think we need to reconsider the traditional view. I find it really striking that Papias tells us. I mean, Papias is writing at 100 to 110. We think John, the youngest of Jesus' apostles, the last one to die, died right around the year 100. So we're in the immediate years immediately following the death of John. Papias states, Matthew put together the logia of the Lord in the Hebrew language. Well, isn't that, I mean, we're speculating, the secular world is speculating about some early sayings gospel. and we have the church telling us that that Matthew collected the sayings. So I don't, is it that probably why we're kind of overthinking things or working backwards to something that we already knew? Let me introduce a Greek word, amanuensis, and Steve Dennis isn't here to correct me, but of course apologies to anyone who actually speaks Greek. It means a kind of personal secretary. Scribes played an important role in the ancient world, and it was very common for rabbis, for example, prophets, to have a scribe who served as a kind of personal secretary. In the Old Testament, Baruch, for example, was the scribe to Jeremiah. He followed Jeremiah around, took notes, and then compiled all of that, went over it with Jeremiah. That's where we get the book of Jeremiah. Even in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul made use of these kinds of personal secretaries. The letter to the Romans, for example, was dictated by Paul, but it was actually written by a man named Tertius. We know that. The New Testament says so. And in fact, there are other places where Paul makes it clear that he's not making use of an amanuensis. In Galatians, for example, he makes a joke about how big his letters are when he writes in his own hand. The possible, I have no scholarly credentials, right? Fortunately, I've never been one to let being completely unqualified, So if any of you need surgery or, I'm happy to offer my opinion. I suspect that what the critical scholars are identifying as Q is nothing more than the sayings that were collected by Matthew, and I suspect that Matthew didn't just collect these as sort of oral traditions floating here and floating there, but rather was the amanuensis to Jesus, the personal secretary of Jesus. I'm not the only person who thinks this. There's actually a newer book out that makes exactly this argument, that he was chosen because he was literate, right? He wasn't a Galilean fisherman. He was the tax collector. He could read and write. He was an educated man. He could go back and forth fluently between Aramaic and Greek. And I wonder if the sayings that we have that are common to Matthew and Luke aren't material that was captured at the time, basically in real time, in the same way that Baruch made notes for Jeremiah and compiled them. If Matthew didn't do exactly the same thing for Jesus, that would make sense of everything. That would fit together. It would explain why Matthew was, where Matthew fit in with the 12, why he was called. It would explain Papias' statement that he gathered the Logia. And so something to think about. I tend to think that we have been too quick to dismiss the traditional records we have from people like Papias and Irenaeus. And I think we're overthinking things with Q. We have a perfectly good explanation for the common sayings between Matthew and Luke in the idea that Matthew was the amanuensis to Jesus. So that's what I wanted to share with you this evening.
Thank you.